Hey girl, are you the Hanged Man tarot card? Because you're about to see a new perspective. Today's video is going to be a little different from the usual videos we have on here because today, instead of voicing over a speed paint, this is going to be a pure tutorial. Because today we're going to talk all about perspective. And now that I'm older and wiser, there is no way I'm doing another feature film on this channel because that's way too long. So this topic might just be broken down into a bunch of different tutorials if you enjoy this one. So today, part one, we're going to look at the very basics of perspective. And I'm going to share with you my number one technique that I accidentally came up with. But it helped me understand perspective so well and in such a powerful way, I never needed another tutorial after. And if you guys do enjoy this and find it helpful, I'm more than happy to turn this into a mini series and do parts 2 and 3 and maybe even 4. So how about I'll leave a pinned comment in the comment section below, and let's say if it gets about 20 likes, I'll do a part 2 for perspective. Does that sound fair? I think it sounds fair. As always, if you enjoyed this video and find it helpful, then let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and leaving a comment below. If you like me and my content and would like to see more of it in the future, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell next to it so you don't miss another upload on this channel. And as always, if you'd like more in-depth, intensive tutorials every single week, come check out my Patreon, the link is in the video description. Alrighty, without much further ado, let's dive in. I'm a self-taught artist, you guys know this. I didn't go to art school and everything I know about art comes from the internet and practice. So when it comes to perspective, while there are incredible art tutorials online, I don't just want to repeat everything everyone else has already said, because that's not productive at all. So instead, I'm going to share with you my number one game changer that helped me take my perspective from this to this. You ready? Because this is going to blow your mind. My number one game changer in understanding perspective was to be a perspective detective. Instead of starting by learning to construct scenes in perspective, I worked backwards. I took pre-existing photographs and started to look for the perspective lines in them. And unlike with most other things, here we specifically do not want to start small. We're actually going to do the opposite and start by looking at massive landscape photos. And I'm going to show you exactly how I find perspective lines within a landscape photo. All you need is a stock image. I'll link all of the ones that I'm using down in the description, but you can totally pick your own, and you'll need your painting software, obviously. So there are 3 key perspective points to any scene, because we live in a 3-dimensional world where every object has a length, width, and depth. At least that is how we perceive the world around us visually. Each of these 3 dimensions is represented by a perspective point, and when we arrange them properly, that is how you get your 3-point perspective. But the best way to understand this is to take an already established 3-dimensional scene and deconstruct it down to 3 points of perspective. So let's take this scene for instance, since it is probably the easiest scene to ever break down. The first perspective point we want to look at is the one that creates the horizon. The horizon is what divides the land from the sky, and in most static scenes, it is the flattest horizontal line in the distance. So here, I would say the horizon lies somewhere at the farthest edge where the road seems to disappear off to. Now, let's try to find lines in the image that are almost parallel to the horizon. So you have the smaller mountains, but notice how they seem to start parallel on the left of the screen, but there is a slant that causes them to converge towards the horizon a little bit. Now remember, your perspective lines are always going to be perfectly straight. So even if the mountain itself dips to the ground, your line isn't going to turn abruptly. So when we follow that initial slant, the second line goes something like this. We're going to do the same thing with the larger mountains in the back, and also with the striations of clouds in the sky. These points don't meet within the scene, but if you were to follow them all the way beyond the right edge of the screen, you can imagine they would eventually converge to a single point. That single point is your first point of perspective. Now imagine from that point, if we were to radiate straight lines out in all directions, This is approximately what the first perspective grid would look like. That's it, we've just found our first perspective point just by looking at the horizon and its surrounding elements. So now that we kind of know what we're doing, let's look at the second point of perspective, which for me is always the floor that is coming towards you. We got lucky with this specific image because this second point of perspective is pretty much spoon-fed to us. Very simply, we're going to follow the lines of paint on the road and you'll find that magically they all seem to converge exactly at the horizon. Well, it's not really magic because that is how three-dimensional space works. The horizon is where the floor meets the sky, right? So it makes perfect sense that the lines on the floor would converge at the horizon. So now that we know that point, let's radiate lines out from there in all directions. And you'll find that most of the other elements, such as the grassy banks on all sides of the convergence point, they all seem to fit perfectly within this second grid. And that, guys, is your second point of perspective. In most cases, especially when you're constructing your paintings, this is all you really need because everything will likely fit into the simple 2-point perspective grid. However, just for the sake of completion, let's also take a look at the third dimension, which is up towards the sky. Now, this one is a little more tricky because it is pretty much entirely imaginary, but basically the third point of perspective lies perpendicular to the ground, as in the central line of this perspective asterisk would lie at 90 degrees to the horizon. However, this point does not converge at the horizon, alright? It actually lies somewhere in the sky. Basically, God is up there holding this third line of perspective as if she were a puppet master. So how can you find this third grid? Look for elements in your scene that are supposed to point straight up. Again, this specific scene makes it really easy for us because you have quite a few of those. For instance, you have this little sign on the side of the road and we can follow the little metal pole upwards. As you can see, it goes all the way up beyond the top of the image, and we can also extend it downwards below the bottom of the image. But in order to establish a point of convergence, we need at least one more line. And luckily for us, we have this bit of fencing, which is tiny poles that also face upwards. We're gonna try and find the one that seems to be the straightest, most upright one and follow that upwards. As you can tell, these two lines are pretty much parallel, which means their point of convergence is gonna be high up in the sky, probably on Mars or something. We're gonna send out a new RCBO message asking the aliens to converge this perspective point for us. But if we do fill in the lines all the way across the scene, this is your third perspective grid. Et voila, that is your deconstructed 3-point perspective grid. So now that we know what we're doing, let's see if we can apply this to another scene. Here is a bunch of wildebeest just casually yeeting themselves into the water, and I actually like this specific one. I'm gonna name him Winston. Winston here is creating a splash, and this is actually a really good thing for us because it shows us a different kind of horizon. You see, because the camera is most likely pointed down towards the ground, instead of the horizon dividing the land from the sky, it's actually dividing the water from the dry land above it. So the horizon is going to lie somewhere around here, right? Let's find lines that are kind of parallel to it. So you have these clouds of dust and they seem to run a little bit parallel to the horizon. And thanks to Winston, some of the little ripples in the water are also kind of semi-parallel to the horizon. So if we rough in the first point of perspective, it looks something like this. I'm going to color it black. Next, we look at the ground, or in this case, the water. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because there are no clear lines coming towards us, so we have to start finding some patterns in the little waves. But thanks to Winston again, this is made easier since the waves coming away from his splash offer us some directional cues. All of the waves seem to originate from this point just below his hooves. So if we find that point on the horizon and radiate lines from there to all directions, we instantly see our second point of perspective. Just for the sake of clarity, let's color this one white. Now, this is where things start to get a little tricky, because how on earth are we supposed to find our third point of perspective? Generally, the lines for the third perspective point radiate upwards, but we already have lines radiating upwards. But this is a three-dimensional image, so it has to have a third point of perspective. So where does that lie? Yet again, the answers lie with our old friend Winston, because along with our horizon and ground perspective grids, he's also giving us another important dimension, which is trajectory. He's not just jumping upwards, he's also jumping forwards, right? And this forward leap is actually causing his body to create a diagonal. So if we were to grab a third grid and resize it until some of the lines follow the diagonals of his body, we actually find a third point of perspective that lies outside the far left of the screen. I'm going to color this one to be a bright green. Oh, but what's this we're seeing? The third green grid actually has a line that converges with the first black grid. That isn't supposed to happen, since the third point is supposed to lie perpendicular to the horizon. Unless this converging line is the true horizon. But that would mean that the only remaining grid, the white one, is actually the one that shows depth. But why is that on the ground? Well, my little wildebeest, remember how we said that the camera is pointed downwards to the ground? In other words, you, the viewer, are actually in the sky looking downwards at the scene. And that is why that white grid actually has lines that are coming towards you. You, babe, are God controlling the puppet strings here. So I guess the overarching lesson here is that you can totally supercharge your photo study sessions and get a lot more out of stock images than you ever thought was possible. For part 2, I'm thinking we can use everything that we learned today to work it back up and construct a scene using 1, 2, and 3 perspective points. So if that's something you'd like to see, then make sure you specifically like the pinned comment in the comment section below. Remember, 20 likes and I'll do a part 2. So if that's something you're interested in, go like that comment. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then please let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and leaving a comment below. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you enjoy my content and want to see more of it in the future. And as always, if you'd like some more super in-depth tutorials every single week, check out my Patreon. The link is in the video description, as well as on the screen right now, I hope. But with all of that said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope it's been as much fun for you as it has for me. Check out some more videos up here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!